It shows that we're not powerless against these corporations, that we do have power. And even though it's a David and Goliath kind of story, well, what is the moral of the David and Goliath story? That, Goliath could be brought down, right?
I'm your host, Adam Met, and today we're talking to Naomi Oreskes, professor, climate activist, and author of the book Merchants of Doubt. Naomi has been a professor of science for 30 years, first working in earth sciences and geology, and later becoming a Harvard professor of the history of science. Her work has always addressed the environment, with a particular interest in educating the public on human-caused or anthropogenic climate change. Her most well-known book, Merchants of Doubt, co-authored by Eric Conway and later made into a documentary of the same name, parallels the misinformation campaigns led against climate change with those led against the negative effects of tobacco. We talk about how science became political, what we can do to see through greenwashing, and where we can find climate solutions. A quick reminder that we're planting a tree for every person who subscribes to this podcast, so make sure to hit that subscribe button. And without further ado, here's Naomi Oreskes on Planet Reimagined. So, you are not only one of the world's preeminent scientists in a variety of fields, but one of the things I love about your work is your ability to communicate it to such a wide audience. And science communication in this day and age, I'm sure presents a tremendous number of challenges. But to start out on the dark side, and hopefully we get more positive over the course of this conversation, what are you most afraid of in the world right now?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I used to ask that of scientists that I interviewed, what keeps you awake at night? I guess what I'm most afraid of, well, it sort of functions on two levels. I mean, politically, I'm afraid that as the climate crisis unfolds, it will be used as an excuse by authoritarians to try to gain more power and to further undermine democracy. Because one of the things we know from history is that crises can be exploited, and particularly they can be exploited by dictators and other authoritarians who can use fear to motivate people to give up their basic civil and human rights. And I think we've already seen pieces of that in this country. And I think that as the climate crisis gets worse, and we see more people being directly hurt by the crisis, then that risk increases. And then I guess related to that is just my fear that we don't fix this, that it just gets worse, and that this is a kind of boiling frog or death of a thousand cuts kind of problem that we just get used to. We say, oh yeah, there were these terrible floods, oh well, or these terrible fires. And I think to some extent we've already seen that. So many things have happened in the last year that scientists predicted 10, 20, 30 years ago would in fact happen. And I think the scientists that I've studied who predicted these things 30 years ago would never in their darkest moments have thought that all these things could happen and people still wouldn't believe the science, or leaders would still refuse to say, yes, this is obvious, we need to do something about it. And that, for me, is the most shocking part of the story as a historian who's tracked it. And I can just imagine some of the scientists that I've studied, if they would come back to Earth in some science fiction movie, they would just be shaking their heads in disbelief that all of these scientific predictions came true, and still we're not acting on this problem.
So what went wrong with science communication? I mean, how did the veracity of scientific thought become so connected to political affiliations, and what went wrong over the last few decades?
Well, I don't really put it that way, because I think framing it in terms of what went wrong with science communication is essentially blaming the scientists. It's saying that scientists didn't do a good enough job of explaining it to the people, the public policymakers. But I think scientists did a great job because they did what their job was. Their job was to understand the physical systems, to understand the drivers, the mechanisms, the causes, to have that work vetted in the peer-reviewed literature by other scientific experts, and in addition, to communicate it through mechanisms that have been designed for this, specifically the UN Framework Convention framework, the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And scientists were asked to tell political leaders what the level of dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system would be. They answered that question. They did it, of course, in technical language, but that's what science is. And some of them even tried hard to reach out to policy leaders. In fact, many of them did. I mean, there's a long history of scientists who, in various ways, tried to reach out to policy leaders to make themselves available, to explain what they were learning. So I really think that scientists did what they were trained to do, what they could be expected to do. But we also know, and this is where my research kicks in, that really pretty much as soon as the science began to become clear, pretty much as soon as scientists began to say, oh, climate change isn't just a prediction about the future, climate change is actually something that's starting to happen now, and we can reasonably expect it to have many serious adverse consequences. That's when the disinformation campaign kicked in. And that's when scientists became the targets of attack. It's when the fossil fuel industry and its allies started massive advertising and public relations campaign to confuse people about the science, to make us think that the science wasn't settled, to cast doubt on the integrity of scientists, say they were just in it for the money. And scientists were blindsided by that. They didn't know how to respond because they had never experienced, or at least most of them had never experienced anything like that before. Now, in our research, we showed that actually that this was part of a pattern that we could trace back to the tobacco industry. But the scientists who had experienced what the tobacco industry had done were a different group than the climate scientists. So the climate scientists didn't realize that this was, in a way, an encore or a repeat performance. So they weren't savvy about it. They didn't understand that this was actually the same thing. And so part of our work has been about laying this out so that scientists and other people can understand that this is conscious and deliberate disinformation, and its intent is to confuse us so that we're not motivated to act.
So while it's a different group of scientists now, it was still a very similar approach, as you've written about multiple times. I mean, BP coining the term carbon footprint in order to put the onus on individuals, Exxon knowing for decades about the effects of the main product that they produce on the planet. How did it get this far, even though it's a different group of scientists that are working on the problem?
Well, I think two things. Money is clearly part of this story. In my own work, I don't focus so much on the money because I don't find money interesting. I find ideas and thoughts and ideology much more interesting. So my work has really been focused on trying to understand the ideological connection. And so what Eric Conway and I showed in Merchants of Doubt was that the fossil fuel industry was very clever. They knew that if they said, oh, we, the fossil fuel industry, don't believe the science, most of us would smell a rat. We would realize that the fossil fuel industry had a vested interest in selling more fossil fuels and couldn't be trusted to tell the truth. So they aligned themselves with what they called third-party allies, other groups who, for their own reasons, were resistant to accepting the message on climate change. And in most cases, those reasons were not explicitly about money. I mean, money obviously played a role, but they were much more political and ideological. And they were linked to the conservative suspicion or hostility to government and the idea that government action threatens personal freedom. Now, this is an old line of thinking in conservative thinking. You can trace this back to Edmund Burke. It's not all wrong. There's no question that overreaching governments can interfere with the rights of individuals. This country was created in part because of that experience, to reject monarchy, and to reject absolutism, and to create a form of governance that would be more respectful of the rights of individuals and more responsive to the desires of the people. And that was all good. And that's the good side of conservative thinking. Yeah. It's the part of it that deserves to be respected and preserved. But it got caught up in the late 20th century with an additional component, which is this pro-market ideology. You can call it neoliberalism. That term is a little problematic for a variety of reasons, but it becomes connected with neoliberal thinking that we just have to let the market solve our problems, that markets are powerful, that markets are efficient, and that government is not only inefficient, but it's a threat to our freedom. And that idea was really promoted strongly by a group of neoliberal thinkers after World War II, but it doesn't really get teeth in the United States until Ronald Reagan.
Hmm.
When Reagan becomes president, he really brings this idea to the forefront. And with his great communication and rhetorical skills, he comes up with some really clever slogans, like his famous line, "Government isn't the solution to your problem, government is the problem. We just have to trust to the magic of the marketplace." And that's very powerful. And a lot of people buy into that. And why they buy into it is a complicated story, but they buy into it. But more important for our story is the fossil fuel industry buys into it. They see how they can use that to their advantage. Because if we think government is not the solution, but the problem, then we're going to be very suspicious of government solutions to climate change. And so the fossil fuel industry begins to fund libertarian, conservative, and right-wing think tanks. And this has been well documented by other colleagues, particularly Bob Ward at the Grantham Institute, that ExxonMobil and other fossil fuel companies poured tens, hundreds, maybe even billions of dollars, hard to track because they have a lot of ways of hiding the money trail. But we know for sure hundreds of millions of dollars were poured into libertarian think tanks like the Cato Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Heartland Institute, the Hudson Institute. The list goes on and on and on.
Wow.
At one point, I started making a slide and I couldn't fit it all in one slide and have the font still be legible. So there are dozens, scores, maybe even hundreds of these organizations now that promote this free market message. And I think it's a complicated thing. It's hard to get a hold of because I think some of it is what we could call honest conservatism, people who really genuinely believe, that the government that governs best is the government that governs least, but they have made common cause with what I consider to be a dishonest and noxious industry selling a product that's killing people. And that, again, we saw in the tobacco story, very, very similar pattern. So we see this sort of common cause of money and ideology, and that's really, really powerful because then people don't think that it's just, evil companies trying to make money no matter who they hurt, but that there's some principle behind it. And of course, there is some principle behind it, but at this point in history, with so much that we now know about the reality of this problem, the dangers of fossil fuel, and people being hurt, right? The damage is no longer in the future. It's right here, right now, floods, fires, hurricanes, you name it. It's become a kind of evil thing because people are being hurt, because it's causing us to turn a blind eye to suffering.
What about other types of corporations? Corporations that aren't oil and gas. There is a tremendous amount of greenwashing, and we've talked about that a lot in other episodes of the podcast. Where are we in the life cycle of greenwashing? Is it going to get way worse before it gets better?
Well, again, the greenwashing question is a complicated one. I like to think of it in terms of a couple of different things that are going on. So one is what I like to call the carbon combustion complex. We have a lot of companies whose profits, whose business models depend on cheap fossil fuel. And if you look at the history of climate denial organizations, for example, the Global Climate Coalition that was very active back in the 1990s, it wasn't just the fossil fuel companies. It was also the major automobile manufacturers. It was Alcoa Aluminum, because they use huge amounts of electricity in aluminum smelting. It was the asphalt manufacturers of the world who want us to keep driving cars on roads made with petroleum products. So you have a whole network of industries with a vested interest in keeping fossil fuels cheap. And many of those industries have been involved in supporting disinformation and in blocking climate action. Now, I think it's changed a bit for the 90s. I think we certainly see some of the car manufacturers have realized that they don't have to do that because they could build electric cars. We can still use the same network of of roads. We can still drive automobiles, but they need to be a different kind of automobile. So I think we've seen progress in Detroit, and that's to be acknowledged and praised and blessed.
Yes, yes.
But we have other companies that continue through third-party allies, through the American Legislative Exchange Council, through the Chamber of Commerce, to continue to block action, to lobby heavily against any meaningful action on climate change, or as we saw in some recent revelations, to say that they support a carbon tax, but because they know it's never going to happen anyway, in part because anytime anybody gets serious about a carbon tax, they're there to fight it.
Yeah.
Now, in addition to that, you have a lot of other companies in the private sector who want to be perceived to be on the right side of history. And there, I think it's very, very complicated. I think we do have companies that are really working hard to try to figure out how to do a better job, how to be more responsible corporate citizens. I think Unilever has got a lot of attention for its efforts to green up its supply chain. I'm not an insider there, but from what I've seen of it, it seems genuine and authentic. And they've coupled it with some cool other things, like also changing their advertising to be much more diverse. They own Dove soap. If you've ever seen the ads for Dove soap, they're actually kind of cool. They feature women of all sizes, shapes, and colors. So I think there are companies like Unilever that are genuinely trying to move the needle. And then, as we know, there are other companies who are pretending. And BP is a really egregious example, because the whole idea of that, they're trying to help by helping us identify how we drive this problem while denying their own central role, or at least downplaying their own central role. I think that's pretty unprincipled and pretty unattractive.
Definitely. You briefly mentioned nonprofits and the nonprofit sector. So this is also another tricky one, because nonprofits in a lot of instances rely on corporate funding. And how do you reconcile with this? I mean, us at Sustainable Partners, the organization that produces this podcast, we take money from entities that are not BP and Chevron and Exxon, but they're also not completely carbon neutral. But we don't let them influence the research that our fellows do during our summer program, and we don't let them influence the questions that I'm asking you on this podcast. How should the nonprofit world reconcile with this need of funding, of course, but not provide opportunities for corporations to signal good work if it's not actually good work?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Of course, people in the nonprofit world have obviously spent more time thinking about this than I have. But I do think that it's really important that nonprofits not be naive about this issue. I've certainly seen some people in, what I call the Fortune 500 nonprofits, the legacy environmental groups, who say, oh, of course we're not influenced. Well, that's just silly. I mean, that's like scientists saying, of course we're not influenced when we take money from tobacco. The evidence does not support that hypothesis. We have huge amounts of data. There are people who have actually studied this, particularly in the case of tobacco. And we know that when you take money from an actor with a vested interest, it does influence what you do. And I think we have examples where we've seen that in the nonprofit sector. So I do think that nonprofits have to have some kind of set of principles about who they will and won't take money from and how they draw those lines. Nobody's perfect. If we only took money from people who are perfect, then you're right. We'd be moral but broke. So we all, we get it. I get it. I mean, it's the same with my research funding. I mean, almost all of my research funding has come either from the federal government through the National Science Foundation or through nonprofits like the American Philosophical Society, for example. I've taken very little money over the course of my life from, what you could call interested parties. But, my PhD was supported by a mining company. And I also had a fellowship from Chevron, little known fact, as a graduate student. Yeah, I know, isn't that great? I love the fact that I had a Chevron fellowship. So the point is, we're all making choices all the time, but it's about being mindful about those choices, setting up strategies, as you said, policies that they don't get a say in what you decide to work on. They don't get to review your findings in advance of other people. They don't get to weigh in. They don't get to design the studies. They don't get to supply the samples. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can do to protect yourself from inappropriate influence. And you can also just say, and I do think that for groups working on climate change, I mean, I personally think it's absurd for any group working on climate change to be taking money from a fossil fuel corporation. I just think that is a massive, unalloyed conflict of interest, and it just doesn't work. And I think we have seen in a couple of cases the ways in which it doesn't work.
So I want to circle back to academia, because the point you just made makes me think of a study, and I'm trying to remember who put it out. But there are schools around the US and around the world that are environmental science programs that do take money from Chevron and take money from BP. So first of all, how do you reconcile that? But I want to ask a second part of this question. And then
I don't reconcile that. I think it's appalling.
Okay.
I think that a lot of universities have been, well, either naive or dishonest in
Mm.
taking money from fossil fuel corporations to support environmental programs. And it's not even just some, I mean, it's very, very significant numbers. A few years ago, I got a phone call from a headhunter asking me if I would be interested in being considered to be the head of the new Irving Program in Environmental Studies at Dartmouth College. And I was on the telephone, I said, is this an April Fool's joke? Is this like, you're not serious? I mean, but they were dead serious, and Dartmouth now has an Irving Center on Environmental Sciences. I mean, to me, that just doesn't pass the laugh test. You may as well have the Philip Morris, Center for Respiratory Health, right? It's just
Wow.
ridiculous, and yet academics do this all the time.
I have one last question for you before I'll let you go and eat your rice. We started out with the most dark side of this conversation. What are you the most optimistic about? And I know that you just mentioned about having more women science communicators, and you seem very optimistic about that, but is there another thing that you're really excited about or optimistic about for the future of climate?
Well, there's been a tough year, right? I mean, a lot of
Yeah.
bad things have happened, and it's, I get sometimes almost a little bit annoyed. Sometimes I'll get invited to give a talk where the invitation goes like this: we want you to come. We love how you speak truth to power. We love the fact that, you're really clear about how serious this issue is. And please end on a happy note. And sometimes that feels a little weird because telling the truth is not always happy. And sometimes, and I think we are confronting a pretty tough situation right now. And on some level, we need to sit with that, and we need to really absorb it, because I think unless you actually absorb how bad this is, you don't actually have the motivation you need to really get to work in the way we need to and at the scale we need to. That said, I also realize that if people become depressed, despair is not generally a good basis for action. So I would say what makes me hopeful, well, a couple of things. First of all, my students are so clued into this issue. There has just been a giant change in what the students know and how much they care about this issue. Even I would say just in the last 10 years. 10 years ago, I had students coming out of high school. If I was teaching freshmen, I could not count on them even really knowing what anthropogenic climate change was. Now they all know. So that's a giant step forward. And they're all concerned. They all take it seriously. I mean, I'm teaching a class right now. I call it Life and Death in the Anthropocene. Maybe there's a student in class who's, skeptical, but if so, they haven't said anything, because usually by now, by week 4, somebody would be saying, well, my uncle says, that really, at least, I mean, I know that still exists in America, but at least in the corridors of higher education, or at least elite higher education, that has really changed. Also, our students are so smart about this issue. So at Harvard, where I teach, we have just divested, or the administration has announced that it's actually kind of already divested, is continuing or something. A little hard to figure out exactly what they were saying in their announcement. This was the work of students and faculty, but especially students. It was the undergraduates who led the divestment movement, and they were smart about it. They were informed, they were educated, they thought hard about what their strategies were, and they really did their homework. And one of the things that I like to point out is that if the university had listened to the students 10 years ago, our portfolio would have been in better shape, because fossil fuel stocks have not done well, right? Yeah. So the energy and intelligence which the students have brought to this issue, and really led, I mean, the faculty supported the students, but it was really the students who led. And I think that was really inspiring, and not just at Harvard. We've just heard this week, BU has announced its divestment, and that was a great announcement, because the president of BU specifically said that the student activism had played a really major role in forcing the trustees to listen. And I mean, how great is that, right? We spend so much time talking at our students, and we spend so much time saying that, we're teaching critical thinking skills, but yet half the time we don't actually listen to our own students, right? And for BU to say, we listen to our students and we realized that they were right. I mean, that's just a great thing. And now Minnesota has also announced, there's now, I think, 1,300 colleges, universities, and other institutions around this country who have announced either already have or are announced that they will divest from fossil fuels. And that's huge because it's sending a giant signal to the investor community that it's just not okay to be investing in a product that is destroying our future. So I think that's really positive. It shows the power of activism. It shows that we're not powerless against these corporations, that we do have power. And even though it's a David and Goliath kind of story, well, what is the moral of the David and Goliath story? That, Goliath could be brought down, right? And so we're seeing, millions of Davids all across this country, Davids and Davidas. And I think we are going to bring down this Goliath. We just have to hope that Goliath doesn't pull the rest of us down with him.
I so appreciate your energy, your clear communication on these issues, and for taking the time to talk to me today.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.